Hi everyone, it's Ren here, and in this video I will be talking about philosophy. Again, Open Monism is back to the forefront for now. In this new installment of Open Metaphysics, I want to go into a little bit more detail about the attributes of eminence, which I described as part of a kind of little introduction in the previous video. So as you remember, there are 5 attributes of eminence, which are intimacy, silent infinity, givenness, foldedness, and recursiveness. And I think it's kind of good to remember them in that order, and I will be describing them one by one in that order. And hopefully it will be clear once I once I embark upon this task, why I do it. So, what are these attributes of immanence? Such that anything that is immanent has those attributes inherently, in such a way that those attributes are what makes what is limited by reality as logical conceivability, and what structures immanence, being a structure, which I will describe in later videos, must also be compatible with these 5 attributes. And these 5 attributes are manifested, of course, in presence, that is in actuality, that is in the world. And now that I'm going to describe these attributes, and this is an important point to make, I'm going to be describing these attributes from the point of view of where I experienced them, where I got the sort of sense and insight that I was in the presence, indeed, of these attributes. And so it has to be sort of kept in mind. I'm always drawing my observations and, in a sense, sourcing my evidence from the viewpoint of my own person as a being in actuality. I am not directly in touch with my virtuality. I'm an actual being. I'm an actualized being, and so this is where I draw my observations and inferences about the 5 attributes. But since there is a perfect correspondence between actuality and virtuality in Open Monism, these attributes ought to be just as prevalent, just as the same in number as they are in presence. But I will be speaking about them from the aspectual viewpoint of presence, which is the viewpoint from which I am speaking right now, the viewpoint from which, as an individual person called Ren, I am always speaking. Okay? So the first attribute of eminence I want to talk about is intimacy. What is intimacy as an attribute of eminence? Well, intimacy is simply the fact that when we are never just sort of alone by ourselves. There is always a pre-given ground, if you like, that is kind of containing the situation in which we are thrown when we are given into the world. From the moment that we're never just there floating about in nothingness or in emptiness, more precisely. No, we are actually always in a world. What's around me here is a world. There's always a world around us, okay? So, structurally speaking, this would be somewhat akin to the concept of ground, the sense that there is always something around us, something that is bigger than us in a sense, and we always have to deal with that reality, so to speak, when we are living, when we are doing things. So, for example, this bottle of water, I'm fond of my bottles of water. It's actually not the same, be reassured, as the last one, but it's an Evian again. Intimate. If I hit my head with it, I'm like, oh, and it's actually kind of cold as well. It's because there is an intimate world around me. This bottle is not directly a part of my being, and yet it is deeply intimate with me. And this is the first attribute of immanence, which is manifested in presence as this, it's manifested in presence in many ways, such as physicality, the physicality of the bottle. So that's a simple aspect. It's the most a simple attribute, it is the most sort of easily noticed and made sense of, I think. Of course, the insight that leads to it is kind of obscure at first, or it was for me, but eventually I managed to kind of put it on paper, and I decided to call it intimacy. Second attribute of immanence, silent infinity, which I also suggested in the previous video, could be called silent visibility. It is simply this idea that, like, in any given situation in which I am, evolving, so I have to deal with the world around me, like that is pre-existent. That's intimacy, but also I can never quite know the extent to which this portion of the world that is interacting with me as a being in the world, its extent, literally speaking. Like, and if I take let's continue with the example of the bottle, since it's a simple one. So, for example, I have this bottle. I explained to what extent it can be called intimate with me. Well, how is this bottle silently infinite? Well, it is silently infinite because there's so much about this bottle and the presence of this bottle in my hand, which I don't know, I cannot quite tell, like, off the top of my head, and yet is still present, but it is silently infinite in the sense that it feels infinite because there's so much that could be said. For example, where was this bottle made? Who produced the bottle? Who were the human beings who produced it? Who designed the bottle? Where was it transported? How did it get to the shop where I bought it? Who saw it? Who was the last person to see it before me? Who was the last person to hesitate about buying it? Next to which other bottles was this bottle conceived? And like, you could talk about what was the sort of landscape in which this bottle might have been thrown away if it had not been bought. All this landscape of potentiality, of possibility and actuality is part of the silent infinity of the bottle. I cannot quite. It's cold. It's a cold bottle. How many people thought to themselves, "Oh, this looks really cold"? Like, the silent infinity of anything in the world is what it does not speak to you directly, and yet contains in a certain sense. Okay, and we will see in a later video that all of these different attributes of immanence are reflected in our language, and I think this is also part of what gives them credence, of what gives them credibility. I will soon be turning the horrid light on, just to warn you, but I think for now I may stick to my guns. So what is the third attribute of immanence? Well, the third attribute of immanence is givenness. So how could I describe givenness? Well, I'm going to use the example of the bottle again. For example, at some point I know that I'm going to show you the bottle. It's going to be now. It's now. Well, a second ago, you were not seeing the bottle. Now you're seeing the bottle. And this is like a reflection of the givenness of immanence. Immanence is constantly giving events. Actually, it's giving facts out of itself, which are, for some of them anyway, actualized into events. So, for example, a particular unity of events is reappearing here. Maybe like in a few seconds I will be putting on my headphones for no reason, or maybe there will be a thunderstorm or a terrorist attack. I hope not. Basically the sense of like the elongation of present. Sometimes I speak about the future from a phenomenal point of view, from an experiential point of view. We don't really relate to the future in chronological terms, really. The chronological terms of our experience of the future comes after the raw sense of the elongation of present. So we know that there is a next moment, and there is a next moment, a moment during which I could present this bottle to you again, or I could like show you this beautiful pair of earphones that I got myself recently. All these new moments, so to speak, which I experienced are part of the elongation of presence, but the technical term for the elongation of presence is the givenness of immanence. It's not just the presence. Immanence being given means that immanence is not static, it is dynamic. It's constantly giving like facts. It propels facts sort of forward constantly. Some of them which are translated into actuality, that is into events, unities of events, leading to the movements of my hands, leading to the movements of my head, to the presence of the bottle, to me talking about myself or the bottle, to me turning the light on because it is now getting a bit dark. The presence of this light here, all this is given constantly by immanence, and presence elongates itself into the horizon of the future by virtue of the givenness of immanence. So this is the third fundamental attribute of immanence, which really has to be duly noted. So we're making good progress, good headway, and I seem to be in decent shape today, so I'm happy about that. To be entirely honest with you, I actually recorded this video like a few days ago, and by accident I deleted it. So I think that I was really mad about it because it took me a lot of effort. But I think that in the end I managed to motivate myself to record it again, and also I kind of rehearsed it, so maybe that's why I'm performative, or I think I am anyway. But so what is the fourth attribute of immanence? Well, the fourth attribute of immanence is what I called foldedness, which means that, for example, any situation which is given, now you know what givenness means, like it takes place, it was not taking place, it takes place, and there's this constant allegation. Well, it has a very, very great, potentially infinite number of facets, and depending on who interprets them, who perceives them, they will not be seen in the same way, they will not be felt in the same way, they will not be experienced in the same manner necessarily, and they will not be reported on in the same way. The fact that the same event can be reported on by different people who will be understanding themselves among each other, they might disagree. Oh, no, the bottle was not water, it was something else. It was maybe vodka. You never know, because Ren likes drinking. Well, that's not true anymore. I used to live in Ireland. But, any situation could be potentially, in actuality, in the realm of presence, what we say is that any situation, any facts, as we call the facts, of the interpretation of events, which we express in propositions, are always potentially interpreted in different ways. If people can understand each other, even in their disagreement, it means that there is a fundamental happening which is understood or grasped. The grasping of immanence, when I call immanence the immediately graspable or the intrinsically graspable, that's what I mean. There is an almost spontaneous grasping, like as kind of an insight, intuiting. But then people disagree because they fold like the manifestation of presence in different ways. A new aspect of the world as part of the elongation of presence manifests itself. People see that, perceive it as an event, reports on it as a fact, as they call it, or state of affairs, but they don't have exactly the same perception. They don't have exactly the same interpretation. Well, the interpretation of a fact in presence at the level of immanence, which contains both presence and like the realm of the virtual, the actual and the virtual, what I call this is like a particular attribute of the nature of immanence, and I call it the foldedness. So you imagine like having a particular piece of cloth in your hand. Well, the same piece of cloth can be seen by everybody, but like you can fold it potentially in an infinite number of different ways. It will still be the same piece of cloth. People will still be able to refer to it as the piece of cloth, but depending on the way that it is folded, in obvious ways and microscopic ways, it will never be quite perceived in the same way, although the fundamental experience of the cloth will be similar, sufficiently similar for it to be talked about as a specific singular unity of events, but folded differently. A little bit like this idea that I use in my work sometimes of the prism, like sort of facts being prisms. They are what they are. They have a unity, but then like depending on how they are encountered, they're a little bit like mirrors with thousands of faces, in fact an infinity of faces. That's what I call the foldedness of immanence. It's infinitely interpretable despite the fact that it does feature definite happenings by virtue of its givenness. I feel like I'm speaking a new language sometimes, but anyway, I hope you're following me. And now, the last attribute, best for last, most complex for last, the attribute of recursiveness. So, as you know, a recursive object is like an object which sort of, you see a pattern and it keeps repeating itself into infinity. You type recursive or recursion on Google and you'll see what I'm talking about. Well, I think this is a fundamental attribute of immanence, although it is a difficult one to talk about. But it essentially refers to this idea like the next situation which is given can never be fully predicted. And not only can it never be fully predicted in its like every little detail, it can sometimes be predicted within boundaries in the case of like, behavior of animals, stuff like that, or bodies, but it can never be predicted in its entirety. We can know the limits of it, although in the case of human beings that is actually debatable, but we can never quite tell like exactly what shape it will take. Otherwise we could just say, well, it's given, and by virtue of immanent givenness it's given in this way, but we can never quite tell exactly in what way it will be given. We can tell in its rough outline. If we can tell in the rough outline within boundaries for certain, I call it first degree recursiveness, which I apply to basically everything in the world whatsoever, except, as far as we know, at the actual level, the life of human beings. Because we have a history, we have science, we have art, we have technology. Like, we don't know if, like, in the future we'll be destroying our planet because of what we're doing to the environment. We don't know if we will be going in space. We can say, well, we think so, but we cannot quite tell how far we can go or how far we can destroy ourselves. There is this dimension of unpredictability which is not even contained within rigid boundaries. So when the predictability is contained, when the unpredictability is contained within rigid boundaries, so to speak, I call it first order recursiveness, like a recursive object. When it is not contained within rigid boundaries, but either not contained at all or contained within at the least dynamic or fluid boundaries, I call it second degree recursiveness. Like, so the life of human being, for example, the actions of human beings, the activities, the practical activity of human being. When you're talking about objects, or what we call objects, the bottle of water has a pretty, first degree level of recursiveness. Like, we can more or less tell like what it does or what happens to it within boundaries. It's not going to surprise us with the exploration of space. Neither will a fox or a monkey, even though they are intelligent. But human beings, because they have freedom, or what I call in Open Monism, open will, have this ability, or this, it's not an ability, it's a trait of their existential constitution, such that the elongation of presence by virtue of immanent givenness for human being is open-ended, in the sense that its recursiveness is second order or higher order, which is why I often call human beings higher order beings. It's not by virtue of being like higher in terms of worth or value. It's just the nature of their relationship with immanence through their relationship with the world of actuality and the future, through art, science, all those written traces, language, of course, the written traces of the fact that human being is not quite the same being as other beings, so far as we know them anyway. And that is the distinction between immanent recursiveness of a first order and a second order. So I hope that was a good picture of the 5 attributes of immanence, right? I'm not going to repeat them. Now you have a fairly good idea, I hope. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't hesitate to drop a comment if you have questions about these attributes. And see you soon, guys.